Ministry and worship both entail a whole lot of work. In fact, the Greek and Hebrew words behind both of those convey this notion of work and labor. And so ministry is difficult to do. And Paul sends Timothy to Ephesus to fix the problem there. The church was in complete chaos and tumult, and so Timothy had difficult work set out for him. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul begins the fix it plan. And the first element in this is that the church is supposed to gather for prayer. First of all, I urge that you pray. And Paul says he actually addresses the men first, and he says, I want the men to lift up holy hands in prayer. But that was after he started off in verse 1, said, I urge them, first of all, that you pray. And he gets detracted from his train of thought for a little bit on an important theological issue, but he comes back around to say, okay, I want the men to pray. And he says, not just to pray, I want you to lift up your hands in prayer. There are lots of different kinds of prayer postures, kneeling or standing, head bowed, falling on your face in prayer. The idea here is intensity. It reminds me of the time whenever I was in Northeast India on a 2-week mission trip, a very hard mission trip, only getting 4 hours of sleep. I had a roommate. When we would wake up early in the morning, he would just fall out of bed, kneeling before on the ground there at his bed with his blanket over his head, and he would pray really, really intensely, just like Hannah in the tabernacle in First Samuel. Now, Jim Leonard, I rolled over, I opened up my eyes, and they closed them and prayed for about half a minute till I fell back asleep. But my roommate, he prayed intensely here. So God wants us to pray with that kind of intensity. But Paul says, I want the men to lift up hands that are holy. And so this idea here is that people are living innocent lives here. Uh, we remember my mother's song, oh, be careful, little hands, what you do, for your Father up above is looking down in love. So be careful, little hands, what you do. And so this ties in with the Old Testament that says, look, it doesn't matter all that praying that you do. If you're not living a holy life, then God's going to turn his ear to you, turn a deaf ear to you. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make your hands clean, God says in Isaiah. After all, who may ascend the holy hill of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart. So Apostle James says, submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Come near to God and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. And so Paul says, lift up hands that are holy, without anger or disputing. And that passage reminds me of the saying that Jesus uh, said on Sermon on the Mount, but I tell you that anyone who's angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Now, we've heard that over and over again, but a lot of times we don't really realize what Jesus is saying. Let me paint a picture here. This is on an annual trip to Jerusalem to offer your sacrifice. And you know it's coming up. It's a big trip. It's probably going to be 3 days of traveling. You're going to be with your family. You're going to spend uh, a lot of travel time with your neighborhood. So there's a lot of planning and preparation, and also some spiritual planning to as well. You're preparing your heart to go worship in Jerusalem. And so you make a big trip and you have lots of joy and excitement. You're singing songs, you're telling stories, and there's a whole lot of worship going on as you're heading down to Jerusalem. A lot of joy. And then every once in a while it kind of gets quiet. You start thinking, preparing your heart because you're going to go before God, appear before God. And you know that you need God's grace so that you are preparing your heart to worship for God. And as you get closer, everything's exciting and there's lots of joy. but you're getting more and more somber. So you come down to the valley, the Kidron Valley, and you're heading back up the hill to the gates of Jerusalem. And at this point, there's so many people, there's line up, just you're waiting in line to get into the city. You got your family there, you're all bunched up, you got the little lamb that you're going to offer. And you're thinking a little bit more seriously about your worship time. You finally get into the city, and you can see far off into the distance there the bronze altar, and you can barely see the priest performing up there. And you're waiting in line, waiting, and you're telling your kids to behave themselves now because it's time to get serious to worship God. You get closer and closer. Then you realize you're the very next family to come worship, and you're watching maybe it was your brother or your cousin in front of you do their thing, and you're looking inside your heart. Am I ready to worship God? And then the priest motions for you to come forward, and as you step forward, you realize, I have a problem with my brother. I owe him an apology, and I need to be reconciled. And so you pull your family out of line, and you make your trip back to Galilee to get reconciled to your brother. That's how important this thing is about lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing with your brother. It's more important that you be reconciled. I think that many Christians approach worship with all the seriousness of watching a Little League baseball game practice. And it's extremely important that we take all of these things seriously. Yeah, ministry, worship, all of it's hard work, but that's what God calls us to do.